right. Our speaker today is Karen Sachs. And Karen and I actually remember exactly the first day I met you. I don't know whether you remember that, Karen. This was in 2007 on July the 2nd in Washington, D.C. We were on a panel, and the title of the panel was Fishing for a Secure Future. And I didn't know you then, but then we got on the panel together and we worked so well together. We complemented each other so well, and shook up the place. And then the more we talked, I saw that we had a lot in common. We had children who were about the same age, and you are from Africa like me, you're from South Africa, and we all care about the ocean, and actually also the people who really depend on them. So there was so many things in common. Since then, we've been together through your time at PU, and now you are actually the president and CEO of Ocean Unite, a nonprofit co-founded in 2015 by no other person than Richard Branson and the former president of Costa Rica, Jose Maria Figueroa. If you haven't met him, you should try to see this guy. He's amazing, very energetic and fun to work with. So, and all your effort is how to ensure that our oceans are healthy, where we have depleted things, how to regenerate them, how to engage different audiences. You're really your energy and all the things you do just to get action. So you are not just happy about talking things, you want to get things done. And that shows up all through your 25 years. And I wouldn't take too much of the time. You would have all read his bio, and there's a lot in there. And you're a wonderful example for our students, I believe. And we will see more of your stuff today. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, Rashid. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. I wish I was in Vancouver. At least I could have a sense of the sea nearby. I'm in Washington, D.C., and as you can all imagine, it is an interesting place to be at the moment, but not that close to an ocean, unfortunately. Rashid, I can only say as wonderful things about you. Rashid is, as I'm sure all of you know, such a leading voice and a change maker in our space. And without him, there are many things that would not have changed over the last few decades in the ocean space. And so we are incredibly grateful to everything that he does and all that UBC has done over the years on ocean conservation, science and economics to change the world. So I am going to try and combine a few of those things and delve into a bit of finance as well this afternoon. And this is a talk that has some new pieces in it. And so feedback is completely appreciated. And I think as we head into next year, 2020 was supposed to be the super year for the ocean. It wasn't because of COVID. A lot of the meetings have been delayed until next year. And now governments are talking about 2021 as a super year for nature. And it's a key year where some decisions need to be made. But very clear at the center of that now is the issue of financing and how we finance a net zero future and how we finance investment into nature. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that we're doing on investment into nature-based solutions. It's about collaboration and really kind of reinvigorating multilateralism by partnering across sectors to drive change. Second, it's about driving investment into nature and coastal biodiversity, nature-based solutions to build a more sustainable future. And third, it's about deploying financial and insurance tools and innovation to recover faster and build greater resilience to change. So let's just dive into the ocean for just a little bit. Before we discuss some of those bigger issues. So as all of you know, the ocean is vital for supporting life on our planet. It's also a significant source of goods and services to the world economy. but it is changing faster today than it has at any time in human history. The ocean is warming, rising sea levels, acidification, marine pollution, habitat destruction, all are creating greater risk and uncertainty with wide-ranging implications for coastal communities, infrastructure, biodiversity, and the lives and livelihoods of billions of people around the world. So this table is from a Crow Forum report on insurability and resilience in a changing climate, and it was released in January 2019, and it's probably about to be out of date, or is maybe out of date already, but it paints a really stark picture because it evaluates the potential impacts of climate change based on IPCC projected scenarios. And you can see that if we exceed the 1.5 degree Paris target, we've got really significant problems ahead of us, with half to almost 2 meters of sea level rise, and those projections are definitely increasing, significantly stronger and wetter tropical cyclones, a higher frequency of extreme rainfall, and between 11 and $27 trillion in coastal assets to defend. And that, in essence, is ocean risk. It's a shift in perspective to look at the climate emergency and the biodiversity crisis from the ocean looking into land. The global investment manager BlackRock told investors last year that new methods of understanding and forecasting climate risks show that many in the financial sector have underestimated their exposure to the extreme weather events that are likely to result from global temperature rise. And ocean heating is behind many of these extreme events. Just in this past month, in an already record-setting 2020 Atlantic hurricane season, we saw Hurricane Eta near Category 5. So that's wind speeds of 157 miles per hour or higher. Some models indicate that it might have reached that category before it made landfall, which would make it the first Atlantic storm to reach Category 5 in November since 1932. Eta matched the 2005 record as the 28th named storm in the Atlantic hurricane season, which specialists indicate is far from over. And in fact, hot on the heels of Eta was Hurricane Iota, now the strongest hurricane on record in November, and it hit Nicaragua, and it's the 30th named storm of the season. And this season has been particularly exacerbated by higher than average sea surface temperatures in the Caribbean and the Atlantic because of ocean heating. But it's not just the Atlantic and the Caribbean. If you look at the Pacific, we've just seen Super Typhoon Goni, which is the equivalent of a Category 5 hurricane, explode into being named 2020's strongest storm on Earth, with peak winds hitting 195 miles per hour. It crashed into the Philippines. Pacific ocean waters were at around 86 to 88 degrees Fahrenheit, or 30 to 31 degrees Celsius. So that's 2 to 3 degrees Fahrenheit, or 1 to 1.5 degrees Celsius warmer than normal. Ocean heating. Now, already we've got more than 40% of the world's population living in coastal areas. Tens of millions are driven into poverty each year as natural disasters edge out already marginal sectors, with huge implications for the most vulnerable. They also result in significant costs to the financial sector, with insurers paying out over $300 billion for coastal storm damage in the past decade, which is far less than what it's costing governments and taxpayers. By 2050, it's estimated that 800 million people will be at risk from storm surge from extreme weather events, and over 570 low-lying coastal cities will face sea level rise of at least 0.5 meters. The global community is going to face annual costs of over $1 trillion to coastal urban areas from the combined effects of rising sea level and extreme weather events on our coastlines. But we can shift this trajectory. There's a significant benefit or dividend to be earned from building resilience in on the front end and anticipating these risks rather than figuring them out after the fact. So standard investment models don't actually take account of climate change or other risks. Neither do many government plans. If they did, the UN estimates that almost $400 billion could be saved in the next 15 years from investments into disaster risk management. So we need to work on how to change current models to take account of ocean risk and drive investment into mitigating harm and building resilience. The scale and urgency of the challenges that are posed by ocean-derived risks really do call for a transformative and global response. And investing in nature-based solutions is going to be a key part of that. Most investment into build resilience goes into grey infrastructure like seawalls or dikes. And nature has either been ignored as an externality or underpriced by the finance and insurance sector. But if we start to change our mindsets and instead consider that nature has been developing and refining engineering solutions to hold back storm surge, reduce seawater inundation, or filter toxins and pollutants for millennia, while us humans have just been developing built solutions for a small fraction of that time, then it might become clearer how investing in these tried and tested systems, the mangroves, coral reefs, salt marshes, or sand dunes, makes a lot of common sense, as well as a lot of business sense. So let's think about these nature-based solutions. They offer really a triple bottom line. They are first cost-effective, second, they have significant environmental, social, and economic co-benefits, and third, they reduce exposure to risk, including emerging climate and ocean risks. So I'm going to go through each of these. So let's look at the first one, that they are cost-effective. Here are 3 examples. The median cost of building a tropical breakwater is about 15 times greater than the cost of restoring a coral reef. A healthy reef can reduce incoming wave energy by up to 97%. In the Gulf of Mexico, for every $1 that is spent on wetlands and reef restoration, there's a $7 flood reduction benefit. In Los Angeles, retrofitting storm drains costs $2.8 to $7.4 billion for green infrastructure and approximately $44 billion for grey infrastructure. So I think that's pretty clear in terms of cost effectiveness. Second, let's look at some of the added co-benefits from investing in nature. We've got additional climate security from carbon sequestration. So mangroves are fantastically naturally engineered carbon capture and storage sites. They can sequester 5 to 10 times more carbon from the atmosphere than terrestrial forests. Biodiversity and food security are additional co-benefits, with these nature-based solutions being safe havens and nurseries for species. The recent UN report showing that not one of the 20 Aichi targets was met and only 6 were partially met. So this is absolutely key. There's a third co-benefit, which these are economic co-benefits. So looking at jobs, livelihoods, keeping communities intact and preventing displacement. And 2019 for the first time saw more people displaced by climate events than wars. So investing in nature is also critical for national stability and national security. And finally, nature is adaptive. Marshes, mangroves, coral reefs, they all grow upwards, rising in elevation as sea level rise, which is key to protecting coastal communities. Nature dissipates wave energy. Grey infrastructure redirects it. Third, amongst all of these things, is that nature-based solutions reduce exposure to emerging climate and ocean risks. So again, the UN estimates that investing just $6 billion a year in nature-based solutions and nature-based disaster risk management measures would save the world $360 billion over the next 15 years. Again, looking at BlackRock, they oversee around $6 trillion in client assets. And they told investors last year that new methods of understanding and forecasting climate risk, again, show how many in the financial sector have underestimated exposure. Just to reiterate that, investment consulting firm Mercer has warned that asset owners should consider climate change at every stage of the investment process, from investment beliefs, policy and process, to portfolio construction and decisions. So here's an example, which I found quite illuminating. Commercial mortgage-backed securities are increasingly vulnerable to hurricanes. Who would have thought? The risk of a building that backs one of these instruments being hit by a Category 4 or 5 hurricane has gone up by more than 137% since 1980, which is absurd if you think about it. The risk of Category 5 hurricanes in the US is due to increase by a projected 275% between now and 2050. But that said, in 2012, coastal wetlands prevented $625 million in property damage from Hurricane Sandy. So again, if we think about it, investing in these nature-based solutions can help reduce the costs and impacts. We've got the numbers and the information to show that investing in nature is a sound business strategy, as well as that common sense. But there are a lot of perceived barriers to investing in natural capital for coastal protection, and through the Ocean Risk and Resilience Action Alliance, which I'll talk about in a moment, we've identified 5 core barriers to private sector investment into blue nature. The first is that there's a general lack of understanding of how investment into natural capital can provide a timely and productive return, and this is true in both the private and the public sector. Second, we don't have tried and tested products that are risk adjusted, that can attract financing in this blue nature space. We can literally count the number of products on a hand, or maybe 2 hands now at most, and all of them are in the pilot stage. Third, the data and modeling for investors to understand and identify ocean risk is largely missing. There's quite a bit of data, but it hasn't been put together in a meaningful way. And a lot of the modelers are looking back into the past rather than looking forward into the future as they develop their modeling. Fourth, the enabling policy environment that drives investment into this blue natural infrastructure rather than into more unsustainable grey infrastructure hasn't been created. That makes it really difficult to push these products forward. So investors don't like uncertainty, and that adds to the uncertainty in the policy environment, both in the private sector and in the public sector. And finally, there are concerns about whether these investments can actually deliver returns in a short time period. Despite that, there is really a huge opportunity to develop the pioneering finance and insurance products that reduce these risks. And this is where this alliance that I mentioned comes in. So the Ocean Risk and Resilience Action Alliance, or ORA, it's a bit of a mouthful, is a multi-sector collaboration between governments, financial institutions, the insurance industry, environmental organizations, and stakeholders from the global south. It has a diverse and growing set of members, observers, and partners. And we look at this, as I said at the beginning, as a new form of multilateralism, where we can leverage public-private cooperation to enable key actors to problem solve on critical issues. The alliance includes big insurers, reinsurers, and brokers like AXA, Swiss Re, and Willis Towers Watson. Multilateral organizations like the UN Development Programme and the Inter-American Development Bank. Countries like Canada, the UK, France, India, and Fiji, non-profits, the Nature Conservancy, WWF, the Global Islands Partnership, and the Mesoamerican Reef Fund, and then the world-renowned Stockholm Resilience Centre and Global Resilience Partnership. And you can see the whole list and learn more about the Alliance on our website, which is at oceanriskalliance.org. Our purpose is to build resilience in the regions and communities most vulnerable to ocean risk by pioneering finance and insurance products that incentivize investment into blended finance and private investment into the regions and communities that need it most. And blended finance is just a simple way of talking about putting together different types of finance, like some philanthropy and public finance and private finance, and mixing it all up and coming out with something that can drive change, because different actors like to see different returns and have different levels of risk that they're prepared to accept. And our aim here in terms of our vision and targets is to drive $500 million of investment into nature-based solutions by 2030 and surface at least 15 novel finance products by 2025. Ocean Unite has worked alongside AXA, which is one of the biggest insurance companies in the world, and the Global Resilience Partnership, which is a partnership that is based at Stockholm University and has spent the last 7 years working on resilience building projects around the world. And the three of us organizations together with the government of Canada have been at the core of building this alliance. And Canada actually brought the alliance to the G7 when it was the host in 2018 and has provided the seed funding for the alliance. So we deeply appreciate Canadian leadership in this space. We just have to get more. So by breaking down our silos and by thinking systemically and focusing on anticipating risks and making the types of decisions that protect against the shocks they might bring, what we believe we can do is leverage this blended finance and blended finance tools that generate acceptable risk-adjusted returns. In the short term, we're looking to identify and nurture 6 to 10 innovative finance solutions. And I'll talk about the innovation challenge that we're running actually at the moment to do that. But the work of the Alliance is built across the 3 core pillars that you can see on this slide. The first is practice and innovation, so actually developing the innovative finance products. And I will go into those in a little bit. The second is science and research, because these are absolute core foundation stones on which to build some of these products. The third is policy and governance, because if we don't create the enabling environment, as I said before, with a level playing field for these products to operate within, investment is going to be a challenge. And 2021 is going to be an absolutely critical year to bring the ocean and climate policy together and drive change. It's a year in which the UK has the presidency of the G7, Italy has the presidency of the G20. Together, they're both chairing the UNFCCC Climate Conference of the Parties. And then as well, next year, we're going to see China chairing the biodiversity COP for the Convention on Biological Diversity. And on the table across all of these meetings is the need for significant commitments to get to net zero, which is the most important thing in terms of ocean health, as well as a global deal for nature for the next 10 years, with a call to strongly protect at least 30% of the planet, that's land and sea. And integral to getting these strong commitments is resource mobilization. That's the technical term. So that's show us the money so that we can move forward. That's the financing to get the job done. And at the moment, the Africa group is actually saying, unless developed countries come to the table with significant financing, we are going to go home empty-handed next year, because they do not want to continue to be asked to safeguard biodiversity after the North has wiped out most of its biodiversity. They don't want to continually be asked to change their development strategies after decades of pollution from the North. and they haven't got the money to do it. And with COVID, of course, all of that is exacerbated. So this is really a key issue. And so this is now I'm gonna trial something on this talk. I told Rashid at the beginning, and feel free to pull it to pieces because this is the first time I'm experimenting with this. So here we go. So on this financing piece, there was a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2017, which argues that if we are to hold climate change below 2 degrees Celsius, natural climate solutions could provide for over 30% of cost-effective CO2 mitigation needed, the cost-effective CO2 mitigation needed through 2030. So there are people beginning to argue that if that's the case, if that's the 30% that nature can service, surely then 30% of climate finance should be invested into nature globally. So the Climate Policy Initiative, which is an international think tank which publishes annual analyses, says that total climate-related financing was between $510 and $530 billion in 2017. So it's almost the latest year we have figures for. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change put it at around 680 billion. So I'm going to take the upper figure, right? I'm gonna say we are spending on climate finance $700 billion per annum. And that's, that's great. And so if we take 30% of that, we could have about 200 billion for investment into nature-based solutions. Of course, we would need to get folks to agree to earmarking that from climate finance for biodiversity. And so that gives us 200 billion. But before we work out whether that's enough or not enough, we've got to think about what is the biodiversity financing gap at the moment, how much is spent on biodiversity or nature now, and where do we find the rest of the money if we need more. So there was a paper that was released in September called Financing Nature. It was co-written by the Paulson Institute, the Nature Conservancy, and Cornell University. And it said that the sum of future global biodiversity funding needs is around $700 to $900 billion per year by 2030. So again, I'm just going to back of the envelope here, say we need around 700 billion a year for climate finance, right? Sorry, for for biodiversity financing. And the UN Global Biodiversity Outlook report noted that just $90 billion, 90, was spent on biodiversity protection in the past decade. So if we think if the biodiversity financing gap is $700 billion per annum, and for the past 10 years, we've only spent 90 billion, we're in a definite hole. We've got a major deficit. 500 billion was spent on fossil fuel and agricultural subsidies in that decade. So what if we redeployed those funds to invest in nature? And then we added on top of that the 30% of the funds from climate finance, that $200 billion that I spoke of earlier. Maybe with those funds, and this is where Rashid is going to come in, we can begin to close the biodiversity financing gap quite quickly. If we think about the ocean alone and just this little subset where we focus, the recovery of mangrove seagrasses and salt marshes to historical baseline levels by 2050 is estimated to come at an annual restoration cost of $27 to $37 billion. And I know if Rashid was not on mute, he would tell us right now that that's about the same amount that is spent on perverse fisheries subsidies annually. So if we can redirect those monies into nature, we could actually begin to build resilience to change, we could begin to close the biodiversity financing gap, and we can begin to shift the current development model. and that's just public financing. So what we also have to do is activate private financing into the space. We need to go back to what I was saying before about generating those risk-adjusted returns and increasing the deal flow to catalyze the billions to trillions of dollars that we need in private sector investment. So I'm just going to go through a few examples now, because I don't want to, I kind of went on a bit longer than I thought on that piece on financing. But this is the most interesting thing that's out there. Not a lot of people are working on it, and we have to find a solution. So that's my challenge to all of you. So some of the things that we are doing in the Alliance, as I said, we're running an Ocean Resilience Innovation Challenge. Can we surface some of these products? It's actually running to the end of this month. It'll be absolutely fascinating to see what emerges. We don't expect there to be, hundreds of innovations that are put on the table, but we just need a few more so that we can start using more than 10 fingers to talk about the pilot studies that are out there. We also, in terms of investment, with the support from the Government of Canada, as we are beginning to invest into some of these coastal ecosystems like coral reefs and mangroves. And as I've mentioned, we've seen mangroves, for instance, reducing annual flooding to more than 15 million people around the world. Without them, 39% would be flooded each year. We've got coral reefs, the natural, submerged seawalls, reducing coastal flooding and erosion, and dissipating as much as 97% of wave energy. But a lack of understanding around the full value of these assets has led to significant degradation and loss. So they are now some of the most threatened in the world, which is why we need to drive investment into them. So the Alliance is investing into a project with the Nature Conservancy, with support from AXA XL, and it's a 4-year project to produce blue carbon and separate resilience credits. And the goal is basically to keep CO2 in the ground, provide natural resilience infrastructure by keeping those mangroves in place, conserve biodiversity, and secure a payout to the countries and communities, keeping this blue nature intact. And as we look at more and more countries, both countries and companies making commitments to net zero, these offsets are going to become more and more important, and those resilience credits could be absolutely fundamental to keeping those areas intact. We're also working with the Mesoamerican Reef Fund, UNDP, TNC, Willis Towers Watson, and the Inter-American Development Bank to focus on how we can develop more parametric coral reef insurance. So this is insurance built around one single parameter. And essentially what it guarantees is if wind speed, for example, from a hurricane hits a certain target speed, a certain parameter, there'll be an immediate payout to the community. Usually insurance takes a long time to pay out. Something happens to your house, the insurance policy person has to come and review and assess, and the assessor comes, and then it takes weeks and months, and we can't do that in impacted communities. So the idea behind this coral reef insurance is that these natural defenses are first protected and cared for before a storm hits, so that they are as healthy as possible, and then cleaned up as quickly as possible afterwards. Reefs can really be severely damaged by hurricanes, losing between 15 to 60% of live coral cover in one event. So it's really important that they are cleaned up and fixed afterwards, and usually that isn't top of mind for decision makers, particularly in a post-hurricane environment. So these parametric measures can combine with plans to care for the reefs in advance and ensure that there are paid, trained workers to get in the water and repair them after the storms. Many of those workers, incidentally, who will have lost their jobs as a result of the storms. So this helps as well to keep those communities intact. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail on some of the science and research that we're doing, because you can talk to Colette, who's involved in some of it through the work with the Stockholm Resilience Centre. But we are developing, it's key, obviously, as we develop these products, to develop the economic valuations, the modelling and the science and research, so that investors can understand the risk profiles and benefits, and political decision makers can understand the consequences of inaction. So we've got the development of a coastal risk index that is being developed, that's looking at developing a greater understanding of the risks of sea level rise and natural habitat degradation on fiscal policy, so that it's well informed and can be anticipatory. So they can look forward to what these risks are, and governments can then understand what the potential for stranded assets are, or harm as a result of that. And then working with the Stockholm Resilience Centre, we're looking at developing a series of synthesis reports to understand the impacts of ocean risk on the most at-risk communities in small island developing states and least developed countries, as well as women and girls. And it's absolutely critical, again, for policymakers to understand that and to build that from the front end into their policy decisions. So, to summarize, we all know our planet's in peril. We've got biodiversity loss, climate change, plastics, all meaning that our ocean ecosystems are in deep trouble. We've got oceans having absorbed 93% of the heat from our emissions, and that heating and ocean heat waves becoming an emergency, and by 2050 an estimated 800 million people at risk from storm surge and extreme weather events. Small island developing states and other low-lying areas are likely to be the most severely impacted, and as I've said, with women and girls especially hard hit. And we just need to look at the flooding events in the Philippines and Central America over the past few weeks to know that this is not a problem for 30 years' time, it's a problem of today. So we need a transformative global response, and it's absolutely critical that we collectively focus on net zero targets combined with efforts to become biodiversity positive with human-centered development, so that we can build resilience to change. If we can bring together the finance and insurance sectors, governments, non-profit organizations and stakeholders from around the world to invest in nature with a focus on mitigating risk and building resilience, then we can begin to drive that change. We are faced with an incredible challenge and the opportunity to build back stronger by investing in a sustainable future and divesting from an unsustainable past. And we hope that through the work we're doing with the Ocean Risk Alliance, we'll be able to shift that curve, move the needle, and drive that change fast, as quickly as possible, because we know that we need to do that. We've got no more time to lose. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Karen. Unfortunately, Rashid says that he had to go. So his parting message, as it were, was, this is important work because great sustainability efforts die at the altar of inadequate finance. Thank you for the talk. And like I informed you earlier, I have to leave soon or now for another event. So he looks forward to touching base with you. But yes, thank you so much for this really exciting talk, and for also stimulating our thoughts in different directions that many of us typically sort of think about. I think all these components are really critical in terms of moving us forward to support the ocean and to strengthen resilience. As people are thinking about their questions and typing them into the chat box, I'll ask one for you. One of the things that I find quite interesting in terms of finance or solutions in general is the balance to be struck between sort of local implementation of some solutions and yet coming up with solutions that can scale.
Yeah.
So what sort of balance are you sort of seeking in the approaches that you're using, or where are you finding that like the emphasis needs to be placed? Is it really both, or is it currently, given where finance is at, that one is more needed than the other?
I think at the moment there aren't very many people thinking about it, to be perfectly honest. But I would argue both. I think one of the holes that many of us have fallen into in the past has been ignoring the kind of local the engagement of local communities and the critical role of local knowledge while developing solutions that we think we can scale. And so oftentimes what happens is, we sit where we sit and we come up with these ideas and then we go and implement them. And they fail because we don't have local buy-in, but we also have not taken account of the local knowledge and incorporated it into whatever it is that we're building. And it's absolutely critical. When we're thinking about some of these finance products, it's local communities, it's municipalities, it's insurance, it's finance, it's then the bigger region or regional authorities, national and then international elements. So we've got to think outside the box, and we've got to put a lot of those things together.
Thank you. Please, everyone, I encourage you to type out your questions so we can ask them live.
I'd love someone to challenge me on also just questioning those numbers, because as I said, I literally, when I was working on this, I pulled them out and I thought, let's see what happens if we throw these out. So please go ahead and do it.
So there's a question from...
Oh,
sorry, go ahead.
No, go Colette, please.
So there's a question from Carly, who says, "Hi Karen, that was incredibly interesting. Thank you. Are you finding stakeholders are now sensing the urgency of moving to net zero targets? It seems perceived delay of ROI has hindered quick movement in this space. Is that still a large part of the challenge?"
So thank you for that question. It is the interesting thing that's happened, and actually this year has been the perfect year for a lot of talking, a lot of webinars, a lot of leaders talking. There are a lot of verbal commitments to net zero, and actually it's moving really quickly. I think there's a huge recognition, and potentially even the private sector is moving faster than the public sector in some places on this, because they can see that they have potential assets at risk. Those words, though, need to be followed up by action, and that action needs to be meaningful and it needs to be fast. And I think that's where we all have to play a role. I'm an advocate, and I never think that enough is being done in this space. So I think we all have to push really hard, both in terms of the people who we vote for and put into office, but also in terms of the power of our purchasing capacity, our investment capacity, the banks we bank with. Do you know where your bank is investing its money? Is it fueling climate change? There is more. The UN Environment Program now has a financial initiative, and they are getting more and more banks and asset managers to sign up to sustainable business practices, and there are more of the banks and the insurers and asset managers that are now trying to reset their investment portfolios to meet the Paris targets. So, it's great to see it happening. We just need to push them further and faster than they think they can go. Because we have to get there, we have to move it. It's just terrifying to see what's going on.
I thought that Gabrielle was going to take the next one, but go ahead, Gabrielle.
So the next question is from Anna Posas. Given the assigning value to nature or investing in it can be difficult, do you know how doing this for the ocean compared to terrestrial environment? Is it easier or more difficult?
It's a brilliant question, Anna. It depends who you speak to, is the answer. There are environmental economists who think that as long as we have the modalities right, you can apply the same types of modalities, whether it's on land or in the ocean. There are others who think that it is far more difficult. One of the challenges we actually have in the ocean space, and this is why actually the Alliance is focusing more on coastal nature than offshore at the moment, but hopefully with time we'll be able to focus more on kind of offshore valuation, is because we just don't have the data, we don't have the science, we don't even know what's out there. Whereas in coastal areas it's easier to kind of assess, measure and extrapolate forward. It's quite interesting actually that as a result of the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, FEMA in the US has now adopted a methodology for valuing nature. And it will be interesting to see if others follow suit, follow similar lines in what they're doing. It is definitely a field that is emerging and growing and needs work done on it. It is a challenge in the ocean space, I would argue, but I think if we, there's also the challenge of assigning a dollar value to nature when it has all kinds of intrinsic value as well. So if we can get a whole lot of economists, environmental economists, working on solving those problems and developing those methodologies. And there's actually an amazing organization now called the Intrinsic Value Exchange, which is looking at developing a valuation set for forests and protected areas on land and at sea, and then being able to use that as a standard valuation methodology. It will change the world.
Yeah, no, that would be tremendous. Thank you. The next question is by Margot, asking, okay, a number challenge. So there's your number challenge. The values for the carbon flux by habitats, nature climate solution pathways, likely vary a lot depending on the country. So how do countries navigate policy around this in the midst of data deficiency and high uncertainty regarding their natural climate solution values?
Okay, that is another excellent question, and it is one that I cannot answer because I don't know. But I do know that that issue has been something that is talked about long and hard at several of the climate negotiations. I'm sure that there is someone on this call who has the answer to that, and I would love to know what it is. But I think I know that the folks who are working, for example, on valuing carbon putting values on carbon in mangroves, recognize that different types of mangroves can sequester different amounts of carbon, and so they're creating almost like a tree of values. It's very similar depending on the species, and then obviously you have to work in the surrounding environment, nutrient pollution, various other things that could be impacting those carbon sequestration values. So I would imagine there are people who spend their entire lives doing this. I am not one of them, but it would be a really good question to answer.
Another question from Patrick Tata. How dependent will the finance project be to the local political climate and stability of developing states?
Again, you guys are rocking it here in terms of questions. It's key. And this is where, in looking at these projects, you have to look at the combination of both the fiscal environment and the political or policy environment, the political and the policy environment. So, it can be that you can have a very stable policy environment under an authoritarian regime, but the political environment may not be that stable in that context, because change may be unfolding. You can have the same kind of thing happening within a democracy. So I think this is the political economy of investment, where we need to look at all of these factors before investments move forward. The insurance and finance sector are pretty decent at assessing risk and assessing those different levels of risk, of political risk as well, into the metrics that they use. So that is definitely one of the factors that are costed into initiatives, as well as thought about in terms of where those initiatives can be deployed.
The next question is from Adepa, asking, I'd like to know if some kind of technical assistance on how to manage and conserve the coastal ecosystem is provided, especially after investing in these communities.
Yeah, so thank you for that too. So again, a key here is that there's a local partner in any of the work that has been done on these products. And from where I sit, it's important to have a local partner that is outside of government, as well as having that, whether it's a council or a regional government partner on board too, so that you can get a realistic sense of what's going on, and that it is clear if there is technical assistance that's needed, that is part of the build out of that financial product. So for instance, in Quintana Roo in Mexico, which has been the first application of this parametric reef insurance tool, there is a lot of work that is undertaken with the local community, and there are actually these they call them I think they call them training brigades for the folks that are trained to look after the reef. And that gives them the technical assistance that they need in terms of reef cleaning, also potentially doing coral fragmentation and replanting bits of coral for restoration. And so all of that needs to be incorporated into the mix of the product as well. The payout can't just be, here's the money, get on with it. It's got to be, we focused on resilience building here, so it's got to be investing in how you build that resilience. The same, of course, applies to mangroves. A lot of the data shows that simply replanting mangroves, you don't get a huge return on the mangrove forests as a result of that. And so there are different environments that need to be created in order for the mangrove seedlings to prosper and regrow as quickly as possible. And so all of that kind of technical assistance needs to be built into.